Hello, everyone. This is Ben Kelly with the Endeavoring Orthodoxy podcast. Today, we are continuing our series on the book, The Word of God and the Mind of Man by the Christian philosopher Ronald Nash. We're going to be reading chapter 2 entitled Theological Agnosticism from Kant to Ritschl. If you haven't already listened to the first two episodes in this series, I would encourage you to go back because they build on each other. The first episode, I read the introduction in the first chapter of the book, and when I talked about how David Hume had a great impact on the doctrine of revelation and uh, philosophical epistemology and how we know God's revelation. And last week, I read through an article that Nash cites in his book by the theologian Carl Henry talking about justification by ignorance. And Henry's real emphasis on there was how the doctrine of justification by faith alone has grown to include epistemology and knowledge, and how current day Protestants really pride themselves of being justified by really ignorance, by faith alone in how they know God. And that's not the classical way that Christians have understood how they know what they know about God. So this week we're going to be talking about a prominent theologian, Immanuel Kant, and his epistemology, his philosophy of knowledge, and the effects that he had on two primary theologians who really led what has come to be known as modern liberal theology. Those two theologians are Friedrich Schleiermacher and Albrecht Ritschl. So we'll talk about them. I'm going to read chapter 2, and it's only about 9 pages long, but I've got about 9 pages of notes to go along with it because Kant's philosophy is so difficult to understand. So take it slow, maybe take some notes while you're going, and hopefully you can stick with it. But this is chapter 2 of the Word of God and the Mind of Man. It's entitled Theological Agnosticism from Kant to Ritschl. At the end of the last chapter, we got slightly ahead of our story, but this was necessary in order to indicate the extent to which the contemporary agnosticism within Christian thought images what I have called Hume's gap. This done, we can now turn to the second thinker of the 18th century whose system has encouraged skepticism about the possibility of knowledge about God. That thinker is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose system is well known for its complexity. Kant's years are 1724 to 1804. Kant readily acknowledged his debt to Hume. He wrote, "I openly confess my recollection of David Hume was the very thing which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction." Kant thought that Hume's work contained a spark which, if fanned, could ignite a revolution in philosophy. Kant ventured to suggest that perhaps even Hume himself did not fully see the implications of his attack on metaphysics. Kant was scornful of the misinterpretations of Hume in the writings of Reid and Beattie, and we talked about these last week. These are Kant's words. "It is positively painful to see how utterly his opponents, Reid, Oswald, Beattie, and lastly Priestley, miss the point of the problem. For while they were ever taking for granted that which he doubted and demonstrating with zeal and often with impudence that which he never thought of doubting, they so misconstrued his valuable suggestion that everything remained in its old condition as if nothing had happened." Kant regarded his own system as a veritable Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had revolutionized the model of the solar system by placing the sun instead of the earth at its center, so Kant believed his system would produce a similar upheaval in philosophy. Philosophers prior to Kant, or so Kant claimed, had assumed that human knowledge is possible only as the mind is adapted to the world. Kant reversed this order. Instead of the mind adapting to the supposed objects of its knowledge, all objects are instead adapted to the knowing mind. the universal and necessary features of reality are known to be features of reality by virtue of their first being characteristics of the human mind which seeks to know. The rationality, that is, the universality and necessity that human beings find in nature, is there precisely because the human mind puts it there. So, what's going on here? The first major emphasis for Kant was to readjust the assumption of the mechanics of human knowledge. The human mind imposes, and this is for Kant, the human mind imposes rationality on the external world and not the other way around. So, this idea that the human mind imposes rationality on this external world is the first step in how Kant will come to demonstrate that people should reject knowledge imposed on them by religious and political authorities. That's something that he's going to say. He's going to say that religious knowledge, theological knowledge, is not objective in a sense because it imposes itself on the human mind rather than the human mind imposing rationality on it. And so, if the mind imposes rationality on the world, then truths from religious or political sources cannot be true knowledge because they are part of the external world. And this is where we get a lot of the ideas like think for yourself or dare to know, because knowledge in a system like Kant's, in an enlightenment system like Kant, it's built by the human mind imposing rationality on the external world. So most of us, we have no idea how much we are indebted to Kant for how we think today. So many of us, we took English classes in high school and in college or even in heck in middle school, and everyone was telling you, think for yourself, do all these things, impose your ideas on the rational world. This all comes directly from Kant. He like Nash said, he had this Copernican revolution where he taught people to think differently. And we don't today, it's so ingrained in us to think like this that we don't even question it. But we have to understand that while I'm sure it did happen before Kant, people didn't necessarily think like we do today, 400, 500, 1,000 years ago. They thought differently. They thought that the external world imposed rationality on their minds, and their minds had to figure that out. Kant is reversing that order, and he's saying, no, our minds impose rationality on the world. And I'll explain how that works. I wanted to read one of his footnotes. Um, and I don't know why this didn't make it in the book, but he puts this in the footnote to this paragraph. Let's see. Nash writes, in Kant's words, hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, but all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori by means of concepts have on this assumption ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the task of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. And that comes from his critique of pure reasoning. So, what he's saying is that we've failed in our ideas to allow the external world to impose rationality on our own minds because it's just led to different forms of subjectivism, skepticism, and whatnot. He says we really need to try to impose rationality from our minds onto the external world. And so that's what he's arguing there. So continuing with Nash, Kant sought to go beyond both rationalism and empiricism by making human knowledge a composite of two factors, form and content. So, real quick, if you don't know what rationalism and empiricism is, you ought to. And I will go over that. But if you want to save yourself some time, those are things that we're going to talk about a lot here. So you may want to pause and read up briefly on those. The content is given by sense experience. In fact, all human knowledge begins with sense experience. But although all our knowledge, and this is reading Kant, although all of our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it arises from experience. What Kant means is that while sense experience is necessary for human knowledge in the sense that no one would have any knowledge without it, sense experience is not sufficient is not a sufficient condition for knowledge. Something else, a form or structure, must be added to the content supplied by the senses. Unless the content is given form or structure by the human mind, knowledge would be unattainable. As Kant put it, concepts, the form supplied by the human understanding, without percepts, the content supplied by the senses, are empty. Percepts without concepts are blind. Human knowledge then has two necessary conditions: the form supplied by the mind, which is that the how the mind, imposes itself on the external world, and the content supplied by the senses, but neither condition is sufficient by itself to produce knowledge. Okay, so what does he mean here? So Kant wanted to go beyond rationalism and or empiricism. All right. So again, if you don't know those words, you need to, but just for a quick reminder, rationalism in the philosophy of knowledge is the belief reason in and of itself is a superior source of knowledge compared to sense perception. Reason in and of itself is a superior source of knowledge compared to sense perception. Empiricism in the philosophy of knowledge is the belief that sense perception is a superior source of knowledge compared to reason. And you had classical battles when it came to philosophy of knowledge between these two camps where philosophers would go back and forth stating which was, the better, which was more dominant in the human mind. Kant wanted to escape this kind of dualism, this kind of war between rationalism and empiricism. And so Kant believed knowledge began with sense experience, but needed reason to form the structure. And so he built a synthesis between rationalism and empiricism. The sense experience, which he calls percepts, were part of empirical knowledge. The form or structure, which he calls concepts, were part of rational knowledge. Concepts, which are the form or the structure of rational knowledge, are empty without percepts, the content supplied by the sense experience. And percepts, the content, are without concepts are blind. And so form without content is empty, content without form is blind. You have to know that in order to understand Kant. This means that as humans take in the content of the external world, the human mind puts form and structure to the content. This is that Copernican revolution we're talking about in philosophy. No one had ever put forward this kind of thinking before, that as data comes into the human mind imposes rationality on it, and the external world is then conformed by the human mind rather than the external world conforming the human mind. So, this is how Kant is able to say humans impose rationality of the external world and that the external world does not impose rationality on the human mind. Imagine the problems this type of thinking would raise on natural theology, apologetics, and arguments for the existence of God, for example. We cannot simply look at the evidence of the natural world because there is a separation between the human mind and the natural world. And in fact, this is exactly what Kant does. He goes on to reject the arguments of natural theology based on his philosophy of human knowledge because the data coming in, it has rationality or form imposed on it by the human mind and not the other way around. In natural theology, our classical arguments for the existence of God, those are supposed to impose a structure on the human mind based on the data that we receive out in the external world. And Kant flips that. And that's what allows him to reject that kind of theology that is being talked about a lot in his time. And he goes on to reject many of the classical arguments for the existence of God. So let me continue. Kant taught that the form or structure that the human understanding supplies to knowledge exists in the form of categories or innate aptitudes for knowing. Since all human knowledge must be mediated by these categories, men cannot know anything that is not so mediated. The unfortunate consequence of this claim, however, was a radical disjunction between the world as it appears to us, the world modified by the categories of our understanding, and the world as it really is. According to Kant, human knowledge never brings us into contact with the real world, what he called the noumenal world. All we ever know is the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us after it has been modified by the categories of our understanding. Since our knowledge is always perceptually modified by the a priori categories of the mind, the real world, noumena, is not only unknown, but unknowable. So, what does this mean? All right. The forms or structures we use to make sense of the sense perception we take in of the natural world is part of human innate aptitude. We have this aptitude where we take in, different kinds of data, and we have these structures that help us understand this data that comes in. However, what he says is that humans cannot know anything that is not mediated by these aptitudes. We can't know anything that doesn't come into our minds and is then imposed structure upon it. Okay. So when the sense data comes into the mind, the human mind imposes rationality on it. We can't know anything until this knowledge is mediated through this process of rationality. And so humans can never know actually the real world, what exists out there, the noumena, because the world as it appears to us has been modified by our innate aptitudes within our consciousness or our mind and how we form structures, the phenomenal world. So our knowledge of the world is always conceptually modified, so we never truly know the real world as it is out there. And that's why, again, that's why Kant would go on to deny natural theology arguments for the existence of God. You can't take the knowledge or the data out there and then deduce that towards, an argument for the existence of God. We can only conceptualize that data and then arrive at our conclusions, our forms, our rationality that we put on it, and therefore we don't really know what's really out there in the real world. We only understand our conceptions as we impose our rationality on the data that comes into our minds. Very confusing stuff, but we have to understand this leads to a high amount of subjectivity, and this had a huge impact on theology. And you can already, those of you who've listened to me before and you've heard me talk about different ideas in the doctrine of revelation, you can already see where this is leading because take, just revealed theology. We have these scriptures. Well, that is data that comes into the human mind and we conceptualize it. So we don't really know what this revealed theology is stating. We can only understand our conceptions of it and how we put form to that content. So you can see how dangerous this is already. Continuing, Hume had his gap, Kant had his wall. Kant's system had the effects of erecting a wall between the world as it appears to us and the world as it really is. Human knowledge is restricted to the phenomenal world, the world of appearance, the world shaped by the structure of the knowing mind. Knowledge of any reality beyond the wall, which includes the world of things in themselves, is forever unattainable. Human reason cannot penetrate the secrets of ultimate reality. Answers to the most basic questions of theology and metaphysics lie beyond the boundaries of human knowledge. Since God is not a subject of experience, and since human categories cannot extend to transcendent reality, Kant's God is both unknown and unknowable. Whenever human reason attempts to penetrate beyond Kant's wall, either in a search for knowledge about God or in a quest for answers to ultimate questions, it becomes involved in antinomies and or contradictions. So, I've been saying that for the last few minutes now. This is why Kant rejected natural theology. This is why he would go on to reject revealed theology as a serious endeavor, and he would kind of sideline it into ethics, because we cannot ultimately know anything about the real world out there. It's all based on how we conceive it subjectively in the human mind. So in Kant's system, humans are not able to have knowledge of the real world or the world as it is. Knowledge of the real world having to do with ultimate reality and theology are actually beyond the grasp of human knowledge, and therefore humans can never truly know God, since God is not a subject of experience. God is actually unknowable. And now we are beginning to really see why experience as a theological category of revelation has been smuggled into modern theology. There has to be a way to get beyond Kant's wall, and Kant's wall rejects any kind of sense experience as gathering data and knowing God, and Kant's wall rejects human rationality as knowledge of God. And so, what we see here is, well, theologians were going to start to think, well, Kant has made a really good case here, and I'm not an expert on Kant. I don't know a lot about his philosophy beyond what I've read about it in different theological texts. But apparently, this was a very severe problem for theology at the time. And so theologians were thinking, well, Kant makes some very good arguments here. How do we get beyond his wall? And what we'll see is that some theologians do try to do that with experience, emotion, this kind of feeling, where experience is smuggled in as a theological category of God's revelation, and it has disastrous consequences. So, continuing, ironically, Kant thought his agnosticism with respect to God was an aid to Christian faith. Kant actually thought he was serving the interest of the Christian religion. He wrote that he had found it, and this is quoting Kant, found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. That's going to sound like that sounds like some of the evangelicals we talked about last week in Carl Henry's article. Deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Hmm. That kind of sounds like some Bible beating evangelicals we know today. So, anyways, continuing it, and these are Nash's words here. They had come to their destination by different routes. Both Hume and Kant arrived, excuse me, arrived at very nearly the same point. For both Hume and Kant, faith and knowledge have nothing in common. Every time human reason attempts to leap across Hume's gap or tries to break through Kant's wall separating the phenomenal and noumenal worlds, as speculative metaphysics and theology seek to do, reason becomes bogged down in contradictions. Human reason cannot penetrate the secrets of ultimate reality. The most basic questions of metaphysics and theology are questions to which human reason can find no answers, not even from God. Hume's gap and Kant's wall represent the limits beyond which human reason can go. They simply they imply, among other things, that human knowledge about God is an unattainable goal. In Kant's system of thought, God does have a role to play. Even though God was one of the unknowables, Kant managed to slip him in through the back door as a necessarily postulate required to salvage morality. For Kant, the existence of God was entirely a matter of faith, to which Kant gave a distinctively practical twist. The Christian should abandon any knowledge claims about the transcendent and take refuge in a faith grounded not in theoretical but on moral and practical considerations. So, Kant and Hume both arrived at philosophical systems that completely separate faith and knowledge. Kant still uses God for ethical and moral purposes, but this is a different God because we really have little reason to understand or believe why these ethics about from this God are even relevant or why they're correct in the first place. And so I know this is some of this is it's thick, it's theoretical, and you can get bogged down by this, but we have to understand these enlightenment philosophers in order to understand why the doctrine of a revelation is where it is today. And so a friend who listens to this podcast was talking to me about how easy it is to see the holes in the philosophy of guys like David Hume, and I would imagine he would say the same thing about Kant, because just from listening to me for the last 20 minutes talk about Kant, you can see so many problems with the subjectivism that his philosophy portrays. But I would say, you know, we really have to be slow with this. So the question arises, why do we even need to know about these philosophers to understand a contemporary problem in theology and reveal truth? And, you know, it's because these guys had a direct influence of the theologians that began to go astray at this time. That's I'm not reading Kant because we need to understand necessarily what Kant espoused. It's good to know what he said. We need to understand he had a huge impact on major theologians of this time that came after him that would change the course of theology forever. And that's where we're going to pick up here when we start reading about Friedrich Schleiermacher. All right, let's talk about Friedrich Schleiermacher now. Moving on from Kant, we want to go to the theologians that he had a huge emphasis and really just an influence on. So, this next section heading in Nash's book is called Friedrich Schleiermacher. As the 18th century passed into the 19th, Kant's rejection of the possibility of cognitive knowledge of God was taken up by a succession of thinkers, including Friedrich Schleiermacher, 1768 to 1834, and Albrecht Ritschl, 1822 to 1889, both of whom became major sources of Protestant liberalism. So yes, if you ever become a student in what we would call modern theology, one of the movements in modern theology is Protestant liberalism. These are two theologians you are going to read about because of their just insane influence on the trajectory of Protestant theology after them and the really all kinds of problems they raise for Orthodox theology. Schleiermacher's first important book, On Religion, Addresses in Response to Its Cultured Critics, appeared in 1799. Schleiermacher thought of his own work as a reaction against Kant's reduction of religion to an ethical exercise of the will. But despite his protests against Kant, Schleiermacher's position in the end became an extension of Kant's theological agnosticism. So Schleiermacher thought he was answering Kant's position of reducing God and religion to a complete ethical consideration, but Schleiermacher thought he was really participating in apologetics, Christian apologetics, and adapting Christianity to fit the modern philosophy of the day. But what he would do is he would end up having really a negative reaction or a negative effect on theology. So, continuing, distinguishing between the kernel and the husk of religion, and that's important in modern theology, those two concepts, kernel and husk, you'll hear that over and over again in modern theology. Distinguishing between the kernel and the husk of religion, Schleiermacher suggests that many of the cultured despisers of religion in his day were in fact offended by non essential elements of Christianity. This dispensable husk of religion, in his view, included the metaphysical theories and theological doctrines that so many unbelieving intellectuals found incredible. He wrote, "For what are these doctrinal structures, these systems of theology, these theories about the origin and the end of the world, these analyses concerning the nature of an incomprehensible being? Here everything elapses into callous argumentation. Here even the sublimest subjects are made pawns of controversy between competing schools of thought. Now surely this is not the character of religion. If therefore you had paid attention only to these religious dogmas and opinions, you do not yet know religion itself at all. And religion is not what you are objecting to. Why haven't you gone deeper to find the kernel lying inside these outer layers?" End quote. Schleiermacher's On Religion went on to reject two erroneous approaches to religion. On one hand, he attacked those who thought of religion primarily as a way of thinking or knowing something. Among those who followed this way were the Orthodox, who stressed the importance of right thinking and correct doctrine. On the other hand, Schleiermacher criticized those like Kant who viewed religion primarily as a way of living or doing, as a kind of conduct or character. For Schleiermacher, religion must not be confused either with knowing or with doing. For him, true religion is found in feeling. So, in responding to Kant, Schleiermacher states that religion is based on feeling rather than knowledge or doing, or knowledge or practice. So, Kant stated there can be no theological knowledge. Instead of answering this problem from Kant, Schleiermacher embraced the idea that there is no theological knowledge and rather fought against the idea that religion is only found in ethical practices. So Schleiermacher didn't answer the knowledge problem, he answered kind of how Kant tried to sneak God in the back door through ethical practices. Schleiermacher instead placed religion solely in experience, which turned out to be psychological experience. And you guys know how much I love that stuff. The Schleiermacher is famous because he was the first major theologian to place theological knowledge within experience. Now, think of it this way. On one hand, one type of Christian will favor propositional knowledge as a legitimate form of religious experience. On another will favor ethical practice as the legitimate form of religious experience. Schleiermacher gets rid of both of these options. He does away with them, and he does this by arguing that religion is found in experience, which is described as some sort of pietistic ecstasy. This feeling of ecstasy within religion is the true core or the kernel of religion, and all of the doctrine and the practice that is the result of doctrine is thrown out as the husk of religion from Schleiermacher. It's not knowing, it's not acting, it's only feeling for Schleiermacher. And so I've said on this podcast numerous times that there's a relationship between doctrine and practice. You see this in Paul's letters often, and that's why in Romans, for example, you see at the beginning of chapter 12, you see a complete turnaround from doctrine and going into practice, where he says, therefore, in the first 11 chapters of Romans, Paul lays out correct doctrine. And then in chapter 12, he starts talking about the practices and how the church should respond to that doctrine. Well, Schleiermacher says all this stuff about doctrine, all this stuff about right practice, we need to throw it out the window, and we need to focus on the feeling, the experience, the pietistic ecstasy we feel within religion. So that's Schleiermacher there for you. Great guy. Did a lot of good things. If you can't pick up my sarcasm there, it's layered on heavily, but did a lot of really great things for theology. Continuing with Nash, Schleiermacher was convinced that only someone who has known and studied the human experience in moments of religious ecstasy can know what I gotta turn my page, can know what religion really is and can distinguish religion from its accidental, non essential outward manifestations. Since it is a mistake to think of religion primarily in terms of thinking or willing, faith must be something quite different from a mishmash of opinions about God and the world, the theoretical approach, or a collocation of commands for one life or two, the practical way of Kant. Piety must be something more than the craving after this hodgepodge of metaphysical and moral crumbs, something more than a way of stirring them up. True religion must renounce such metaphysical and practical concerns. Piety does not increase in proportion to an increase of knowledge. In fact, religion should not be thought of in terms of knowledge. The most important dimension of the religious life in Schleiermacher's account is neither knowing nor acting, but feeling. Schleiermacher's two-volume work, The Christian Faith, published 1821 to 1822, reinterpreted all Christian theology in terms of this emphasis on religious feeling. Central to his later work was the conviction that the essence of religion is to be found in a human being's feeling of absolute dependence. And yes, this is groundbreaking for Schleiermacher, this feeling of absolute dependence. Quoting Schleiermacher here, the common element in all or the common element in all whosoever diverse expressions of piety is this: the consciousness of being absolutely dependent, or which is the same thing, of being in relation with God. So, this idea that we are absolutely dependent upon God is actually being in relationship with Him. Later in the same book, he wrote, quote, God consciousness is always the feeling of absolute dependence, end quote. Schleiermacher's view reduces to the position that God is unknowable to the human intellect. Instead of looking for God in nature or in the Bible or in human reason, we should look within. God is to be found in the special kind of feeling, the feeling of absolute dependence, which is really interesting when we talk about, I've talked about before, other theologians, talking about their emotionally healthy spirituality, telling people to look within and find their inner self so they can know God. I wonder where they got that idea. Continuing. Some recent defenders of Schleiermacher have complained about the tendency of many interpreters to make the feeling about which he wrote too much a matter of emotion and too little a matter of thought. So, we talked last week about Paul Tillich being a theologian who changed the doctrine of justification by faith. And it is interesting to note that Nash notes Tillich as a contemporary here, and he's a defender of Schleiermacher. All right. So Tillich, the one who is changing Orthodox theology, the one who was expanding, this idea of justification by faith to include how we know God to really be a justification by ignorance. Tillich is one that Nash has here in the footnotes as someone who is defending Schleiermacher. So just an interesting thought to put out there for those of you who are interested in diving deeper and reading some of these guys. Continuing, whether latter interpreters, liberal or conservative, understood Schleiermacher correctly or not, he came to be regarded as the fountainhead of one dominant form of liberalism, namely the view that it doesn't matter what a person believes, it is what he feels that is important. Liberals who shared this view and regarded Schleiermacher as its proximate source descended on the pulpits of many establishment churches in America like a plague of locusts. So, yes, that again, Schleiermacher had a lot of influence. When he passed away, people were lined up for miles and miles to walk through the church at his funeral. Like, we're not talking about some esoteric weirdo who wrote a few books that have just recently been discovered. He was a theological rock star of his day. Continuing, Schleiermacher's greatest influence, which continued at least through the 1960s, resulted from the fact that people thought he meant to exclude any cognitive content from the Christian faith. Oh, this is why we're talking about him. It is ironic that although Schleiermacher thought he was offering the world an alternative to Kant's theory of religion, Schleiermacher's legacy to Protestant theology came to be regarded as an extension of Kant's disjunction between religion and theoretical knowledge. So, Schleiermacher, in attempting to answer the concerns that Kant brought to the modern world and philosophy, Schleiermacher simply kept a similar wall between God and man because he declared man cannot know cognitive information about God. And that's the problem. He continued he attacked the back door of the ethical concerns about God that Kant had without really ever, you know, dealing with the problem of knowledge that Kant presented. So, let's see, continuing, I've got to check my notes here real quick to make sure. Yes, okay. It is clear that Schleiermacher thought it wrong to regard revelation as any kind of human discovery. Whatever revelation is, it is not something excogitated in thought by one man or so learned by others. That was Schleiermacher's res- um, quote there. As H.D. MacDonald explains, revelation for Schleiermacher is, quote, is not an inbreaking of God, but a upsurging of divine humanity. End quote. Schleiermacher insisted that God can never be known as he is in himself. We can only know God as the creator in relation to humans. Because of this exaggerated emphasis on divine immanence, Schleiermacher concluded that God is too close to contemplate with any objectivity. In fact, he wrote, quote, all attributes which we ascribe to God are to be taken as denoting not something special in God, but only something special in the manner in which the feeling of absolute dependence is to be related to Him. End quote. The divine attributes, then, are not objective properties of God, they are merely reflections of human feelings. You see the crazy subjectivism that we come around with again with Schleiermacher? God is so far removed from humanity, which is his immanence, that man cannot know objective knowledge about him. Any attribute of God we claim, according to Schleiermacher, is part of our absolute feeling of dependence for God. God is love because we feel that God is love, and we express that feeling about God and our dependence of Him. It's not it's not an objective statement. If I say God is love, that means nothing objectively in Schleiermacher's system. It only means my feeling of absolute dependence of Him. Continuing, Schleiermacher went on to reinterpret most of the major doctrines of Christianity in terms of the feeling of ultimate dependence that he regarded as the essence of the Christian faith. Apparently, Schleiermacher's God was anything which produced the feeling of absolute dependence. For him, religion is not knowing something or doing something, compared Ritschl, but feeling something. The major emphasis mentioned in our earlier discussions of Hume's gap and Kant's wall can be clearly seen in Schleiermacher's system. Schleiermacher's God is unknowable by the human mind. He can only be felt in the unique experience of absolute dependence. So again, Schleiermacher didn't really fix anything. He just really reiterated that separation of man knowing God. So that's Schleiermacher for there. Now we want to get over to Albrecht Ritschl. And I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Uh, my I believe he's German. My German is not great, but I believe it is Ritschl. It's Ritschl. Ritschl. So, the second major source of Protestant liberalism was the work of Albrecht Ritschl. Ritschl protested loudly against Schleiermacher's religious subjectivism. That's probably a good thing, although he took it the wrong way, and professed to seek a ground for Christian faith that would be more objective and less relativistic than Schleiermacher's. He claimed to find this ground in the objectivity provided by history. That's going to be important anytime we are talking about uh, let's see, anytime we're talking about Albert Ritschl, we're going to be talking about history and particularly historical criticism, or yeah, the historical critical method. Unfortunately, Ritschl's concern for objectivity did not take him very far, for his search within history for objective information about Jesus was selectively controlled by two presuppositions he borrowed from Kant. The first was that, like Kant, Ritschl excluded metaphysics from theology. Okay, there we go. It's not really changing much from Kant. Just as Kant had consigned God and metaphysical questions to the unknowable world of noumena, Ritschl rejected speculative theism as irrelevant. Ritschl consequently condemned all ecclesiastical dogma as illegitimate offspring of metaphysics and speculative theology. This meant that the Jesus whom Ritschl found, and that's in quotation marks, in history was a Jesus conveniently matched to his own liberal presuppositions. And that's a jab in the ribs to Ritschl there. Questions about the deity of Jesus, the relationship between his human and divine natures, and his relationship to God the Father had no place in the theology of Ritschl. So what's going on here? Ritschl illustrates the common modern liberal theologian, really, and this is the historical critical method, or I can't remember if they call it the critical historical method, but many of these theologians, they often employed criteria for doing theology that intentionally rid the Bible of any supernatural elements, and this was part of the development of the historical critical method, which really was not historical, and it was overly critical. And these are theologians that quote unquote search the scriptures for an image of the Jesus. They wanted to find the true Jesus, the real Jesus, and really they just got back to an image of themselves, an image of Jesus that matched their liberal, political, social concerns of the time. So, kind of like some theology we may see today going on. I don't know. This reading history does have benefits so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, but what do I know? The second controlling assumption Ritschl borrowed from Kant was the conviction that what ultimately counted in religion was ethics. While Kant had kicked God out the front door theory, he sneaked him in the back door ethics. Religion should be concerned with morality, not theoretical concerns. The important thing about religion is its practical effect on the life of believers, not what they know of a body of propositions. This Kantian emphasis appeared in Ritschl's system in the form of a distinction between two kinds of judgment: judgments of value and theoretical judgments. While theoretical judgments are objective and analyzable, value judgments are not. While both kinds of judgment are proper in their place, theoretical judgments are out of place in religious inquiry. You can see where we can run into problems real fast when we don't have any way of objectively, analyzing value judgments. Ritschl's distinction, of course, is a subtle reintroduction of Kant's wall, and the Christian who seeks to attain theoretical truth about religion must bump up against that wall. The only kind of knowledge attainable in religion is dependent on value judgment. It is wrong, Ritschl wrote, to, quote, strive after a purely theoretical or disinterested knowledge of God as an indispensable preliminary to knowledge of faith. To be sure, people say that we must first know the nature of God and Christ ere we can ascertain their value for us. But Luther's insight perceived the incorrectness of such a view. The truth, rather, is that we know the nature of God and Christ only in their value for us. Okay, so ritual ritual bears some similarities with the progressive deconstructors of the evangelical faith today, who we would call ex-evangelicals. They tend to strip knowledge of God of its cognitive and propositional content, and that is why they disdain doctrinal orthodoxy. This is not this is not a coincidence. This is not something that is brand new today. This has been happening for a long time, and it has always be coming from the progressive, more modern, more liberal side of theology. And that's why we see it in these woke interpreters of theology and evangelicalism today. They tend to focus on ethical practices within religion, but since those practices do not derive from doctrinal content, then they are usually the ethics that they derive are usually the ethics of the ex-evangelicals themselves. And the Jesus that these ex-evangelicals like to portray looks a lot like them. It's not the Jesus of the Bible. He's been deconstructed. So if you think what is happening in the church right now, especially in evangelical circles, if you think that is something new brought about by woke infiltration of the church, I will tell you that this type of thinking is every bit of 200 years old and possibly older. This is nothing new. It is a complete rejection of God's divine revelation, man's ability to come to that revelation and know God in favor of some other type of knowledge to replace God's revelation so we can say whatever we want about God. That's exactly what it is. And it's been that way. I mean, that's the first lie in the garden, isn't it? Did God really say? This is nothing new, friends. This is just a more elaborate, a more, in some sense, confused, a more devious, dare I say, way of saying, did God really say? And this has been going on for a while. Yes, it has different context now, but it's the same stuff. What the evangelicals are doing right now in stripping away the supernatural elements of their faith is the same thing Ritschl was doing, back in the 1800s. This is nothing new. So don't get afraid. Read up, learn how to respond, and go about it accordingly. Let's see, I need to find my place. Yeah. Ritschl, like Kant, turns out to be an anti metaphysical moralist who rejects theological speculation about such traditional concerns as Christology and soteriology. Theoretical judgments in religion should be abandoned in favor of an emphasis on practical moral issues. Oh, that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? And when Ritschl finished sifting his objective data of history through his sieve of Kantian presuppositions, not surprisingly, the historical Jesus he discovers turns out to be an advocate for his own brand of Protestant liberalism. Oh, that sounds really familiar. According to Ritschl, the only sure information about Jesus is his moral teaching. Are you paying attention, wokies? Do you hear that? What you're doing isn't new, and some of us are dead on to you. We know what's going on. Ritschl's claim that we know the nature of God and Christ only in their value for us pounds the final nail into the coffin of his alleged objectivism. While Ritschl began by rejecting Schleiermacher's position as too subjectivistic, he ended up advocating a subjectivism of his own. The only real knowledge human beings can have of God is in the effects God has upon us. Ritschl's objectivism, like the Cheshire Cat, has performed an amazing disappearing act. In spite of all of Ritschl's professed concern about an objective basis for faith in history, he tends or he ends upon he ends up founding the Christian religion on the shifting sands of a person's religious consciousness. Oh, that sounds very, very familiar. I'm not suggesting that religious emotion and moral values are unimportant concerns of the Christian faith. Religious life is supposed to make an impact on the emotions and values of the believer, but Schleiermacher and Ritschl did Christianity a disservice by cutting the effective and moral dimensions of Christian experience off from the kinds of objective and rational moorings that faith must have. Thus, do thus do Kant's wall and Hume's gap reappear in the thought of both Schleiermacher and Ritschl. For Schleiermacher, they assume the form of the disjunction between knowledge and feeling. For Ritschl, they become the disjunction between knowledge and value, between knowing and doing, between theory and practice. Now, I've got here to read a footnote about Soren Kierkegaard because Kierkegaard was a major philosopher of this time. Nash did a little bit of research on Kierkegaard, so it's appropriate. Many people think that Soren Kierkegaard epitomized the subjectivism and irrationalism that has come to characterize so much of contemporary theology. Certainly this was the way Karl Barth read Kierkegaard in the 1920s. According to this interpretation of Kierkegaard, the more unreasonable Christianity is, the better. What Nash is going to go on to say is this is not true. Kierkegaard did not believe that he was contextually fighting against a certain type of religious dogmatism, a religious state of the time. And so we should not, and a lot of people have a lot of respect for Kierkegaard and his writings, but um, Nash is saying people misread Kierkegaard in that way. So that was the second chapter of the Word of God in the Mind of Man, focusing on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant with the effects that it had on Friedrich Schleiermacher and Albert Ritschl. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I love answering them if I can get around to it. I am really busy right now, so it may take me a few weeks, but I will do what I can to get back to you. In the meantime, I pray that the Spirit of God would illuminate you, that you would continue your search for truth, and maybe you should just go read a good book. Love you all. Have a great week.